She was thrown into a blizzard to die, cast out by the Alpha, who called her worthless. But in a frozen cave, bleeding and broken, she found 12 dying wolves. Among them was the most powerful king on the continent. He had hours to live. She had nothing but a rusted knife and her mother's herbs. What she did next didn't just save his life. It shattered everything they believed about power. If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. The air inside the Shadowcrest Pack Hall carried more than the scent of pine and roast meat. It carried something darker, the unmistakable stench of cruelty that had been woven into the very stones. Isla stood in the flickering torchlight, a ghost in her own home, watching as Alpha Gideon, the man they'd told her was her destiny, looked straight through her as if she didn't exist. Being an Omega meant being a servant, but being a rejected Omega that made you a stain the pack couldn't wash away. When Gideon finally spoke, it wasn't a decision. It was an execution. A weed doesn't belong in a garden of roses, he said, his voice cold and sharp as a blade. With one gesture, he didn't just reject her. He cast her out into the worst blizzard of the century, a storm so brutal it could kill a wolf in minutes. The cold waiting for her outside was supposed to be merciful compared to the ice in his eyes. The Shadowcrest Great Hall was built like a cathedral, all stone and ancestral pride. But for Ela, it had always been a prison where the walls were made of whispers. Every 5 years, the night of the choosing took place a sacred ritual where the Alpha selected a Luna to balance the pack. To the outside world, it was a ceremony of love and destiny. To Isle, it was the night she realized she was less than nothing in the eyes of her people. She was a mistake the moon goddess had made. She stood near the heavy oak doors, clutching her mother's old satchel. It was frayed and worn, woven with real silver thread that hummed faintly when it touched certain herbs. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, a woman who had died of the same neglect Ela now lived with every day, while the high-ranking she-wolves preened in silks and scented oils. Isla smelled of kitchen lye and damp earth from the herb gardens. Her hair, dark as vet bark, was pulled back in a simple knot, but her eyes, amber and sharp, saw things others didn't. She saw the cracks in the Alpha's mask that no one else dared to notice. Alpha Gideon was a man carved from arrogance and muscle. He paced the dais like a predator, sizing up his prey, his silver cloak sweeping behind him. He wasn't looking for a soulmate. He was looking for an ornament. When his gaze finally landed on Corinne, the Beta's daughter, beautiful and sharp as broken glass, the room erupted in applause that sounded rehearsed. But Gideon wasn't finished. He enjoyed the performance too much to let it end there. Wait. His voice boomed, cutting through the noise. He turned his eyes toward the shadows, toward Isla. Our little Omega seems to think she belongs in this hall. She thinks that by hiding in the corners, she might one day be seen as a wolf. The laughter that followed hit her like a physical blow. Ela's heart slammed against her ribs. Ela, he called, his voice dripping with false gentleness. Come forward. She walked the long, agonizing length of the hall. Every step was a lesson in shame. When she reached the dais, Gideon leaned down. His breath smelled of expensive wine. I see you, Ela, he said quietly. I see the way you look at this throne. But a pack is only as strong as its weakest link. And you're a fracture in our foundation. He straightened and raised his voice so everyone could hear. I, Alpha Gideon of Shadowcrest, formally reject Isla, the Omega. He paused, letting the words settle, but rejection is too kind for a parasite. By the law of the hunter's moon, I exile you. Effective, immediately. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The hunter's moon was the bloodstorm, a blizzard so violent it could freeze the breath in a wolf's lungs before they could even howl. Exiling an Omega into that storm was a death sentence. Alpha. Please. Braina. The elderly cook whispered from the side. The storm, she won't last an hour. Then she should start running. Gideon snarled. He grabbed Isla by the arm. His grip bruising. He dragged her through the crowd past the sneering Karin, past the silent guards who wouldn't meet her eyes. He threw open the massive doors, and the blizzard screamed into the hall like a living thing. With one brutal shove, he sent her sprawling into waist-deep snow. The doors slammed shut behind her. The sound of the iron bolt sliding into place was the last thing she heard of the only home she'd ever known. The cold wasn't just temperature. It was alive. It searched for her bones. Isla pushed herself up. Her thin tunic soaked through in seconds. She clutched the silver satchel to her chest. Her wolf, a small, timid presence in the back of her mind, whimpered in terror. Run. Asterisk, her instincts screamed. Asterisk, don't let him win by dying on his doorstep. She plunged into the blackwood forest. The world became a swirling chaos of gray and white beds. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, snapping like bones. Her feet went numb, then felt like blocks of lead. She stumbled over hidden roots, her face stinging from needles of ice driven by the wind. She was losing time, losing warmth, losing herself. The lethargy crept in the sweet, deadly sleep of the frozen. Isla felt a strange pull to simply lie down in the soft white powder. It looked like a bed. It looked like peace. No. Asterisk, she thought, her fingers tightening around the silver threads of the satchel. Asterisk, my mother didn't survive the Great Famine just so I could die in a ditch for Gideon's amusement. A sudden vibration hummed through the satchel. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, a resonance. She turned her head, squinting through the whiteout, and saw a dark shadow against the side of a granite cliff, a cave. She crawled more than walked, dragging her body toward the opening. The wind howled one last time, trying to pull her back, but she rolled inside and collapsed onto the dry stone floor. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing. Then the smell hit her. It wasn't the damp scent of a cave or the musk of a bear's den. It was the smell of iron, ozone, and something ancient. It was the smell of blood. Ila's hands trembled as she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small piece of flint and a bundle of dried tinder. Her fingers were so numb she dropped the flint twice, the metallic clatter echoing unnaturally loud in the darkness. Finally, a spark caught. A tiny flame flickered to life, casting long shadows against the cave walls. She held the light up. The scream died in her throat. Sprawled across the cave floor were 12 massive wolves, larger than any wolf she'd ever seen. Beasts of myth. With fur the color of midnight and winter shadows, they lay in a tangled semicircle, their sides heaving with shallow, rattling breaths. Dark, viscous fluid leaked from wounds that looked less like claw marks and more like weeping sores of black ink. In the center of them all was the largest wolf she'd ever laid eyes on, even unconscious. He radiated a terrifying power. His fur was matted with ice and gore, and a jagged gash ran across his ribs, pulsing with a faint, sickly green light. Isla realized, with a jolt of pure shock, that she wasn't looking at rogues. She was looking at the Royal Guard of the North, and the man in the center, the one whose presence made the very air vibrate, was Wrecker, the Alpha King, and they were all dying. The king's eyes suddenly snapped open wide. golden, and burning with feverish intensity. His eyes weren't blue. They were the color of molten sulfur, wild and unseeing. The eyes of a predator lost in the fog of a death fever. Wrecker's massive head lifted from the stone. A low, guttural growl vibrating through the floor itself. Even wounded, his presence was crushing. It demanded that Isla drop to her knees, but as her wolf cowered, something else sparked inside her, a legacy from her mother. A quiet, stubborn flame that didn't know how to submit when there was work to be done. Stay back. A raspy voice choked out from the shadows near the king. One of the other wolves, a man with sandy hair matted with blood, tried to shift into his human form. His bones cracked painfully as he forced the change. Collapsing halfway through, this was Keon, the king's lead scout. He gripped a shard of broken obsidian, his hand shaking. Whatever you are, witch or rogue, if you touch him, I'll tear your throat out. Isla didn't move. She held her tiny flame steady. I'm neither, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. I'm an Omega of Shadowcrest. Or I was, until an hour ago. She looked at the king, then back at Keon. If I wanted you dead, I'd only have to stand here and watch. The frost is already in your lungs. And that poison, she pointed to the black, weeping wound on Wrecker's ribs, that's Wraithclaw bile. It doesn't just kill the body, it rots the soul. In 3 hours, you won't be wolves anymore. You'll be monsters. Keon's obsidian shard dipped. The truth was heavier than any blade. He looked at his king, who was now shivering so violently, his claws left deep gouges in the granite. Help him, Keon whispered. The command dissolved into a plea. Please, Isla knelt. She set her silver satchel on the cold ground. As she opened it, the silver threads began to glow with a soft, lunar light. Reacting to the king's celestial aura, this satchel was more than a bag. It was a living map of her mother's wisdom. I need a fire, Isla said. A real one. She didn't wait for Keon to answer. She scrambled to the back of the cave, gathering ancient dry moss and skeletal branches that had been blown in over the years. With the speed of someone who'd spent her life serving others, she built a hearth. When the flames roared to life, the cave transformed. The terrifying shadows retreated, revealing the true scale of the tragedy before her. 12 men, the elite of the continent, lay broken. They were the shield of the realm, reduced to kindling by an ambush they'd never seen coming. Isla returned to Wrecker's side. His breathing was wet and jagged. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the black-veined skin near his wound. Forgive me, Your Majesty, she murmured, the moment her skin touched his. A jolt of heat shot up her arm. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a telepathic scream of agony. Through the mate bond inherent to their kind, even a suppressed one, she felt the sheer weight of his burden. He wasn't just fighting the poison. He was holding the spirits of his 11 men together, refusing to let them cross the veil before him. Asterisk, he's a king, even in his delirium. Asterisk, she realized, her heart aching with sudden respect. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a bundle of moonthorn, a rare, silver-tipped vine that grew only in the deepest mountain crevices. It was lethal if ingested, but when prepared correctly, it was the only thing that could draw out the venom of a fey creature. This will hurt, she warned the unconscious king. She used a flat stone to grind the moonthorn, mixing it with her own tears, unintentional salt from an Omega's life, and a splash of water melted from the snow at the cave's mouth. The paste turned a brilliant, glowing violet as she applied it to the king's side. The reaction was instant. Wrecker's body arched off the stone. A roar ripped from his throat. a sound so powerful it caused dust to rain from the ceiling. His human form flickered, his muscles rippling as the poison fought the cure. "Hold him," Isla cried to Keon. "I can't," Keon gasped, his own strength failing. Isla did the unthinkable. She threw her small body over the king's chest, pinning his shoulders with her weight, her hands pressing firmly into the wound to keep the medicine in place. She felt his heart drumming against her own, a rhythmic, thundering force. "Look at me. Reker," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "The blizzard is outside. The fire is here. You're not lost. Come back to the light." The king's golden eyes found hers. For a heartbeat, the feral heat vanished, replaced by a clarity so piercing it felt like she was being searched to the very bottom of her soul. He saw the rejection mark on her neck. He saw the threadbare tunic. He saw the girl who'd been told she was worthless. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, Reker didn't see an omega. He saw his anchor. His hand, large enough to crush her skull, rose slowly and came to rest on the back of her head, pulling her closer. It wasn't an attack. It was a claiming, but the peace was short-lived. From the mouth of the cave, a new sound cut through the howling wind. It wasn't the scream of the storm. It was the sharp, rhythmic baying of hounds, shadow crest hounds. Gideon hadn't just exiled her. He was hunting her. He wanted to make sure the weed was truly destroyed. Isla looked at the 12 dying wolves. Then at the entrance where the orange glow of torches began to flicker against the falling snow. She was in exile with no pack, defending a king who couldn't stand. Against a man who knew no mercy, she reached into her satchel and pulled out her mother's small, rusted gardening knife. It was a pathetic weapon. But as she stood between the sleeping king and the approaching shadows, her silhouette on the cave wall grew long and sharp, like that of a queen defending her throne. The orange glow of the torches danced against the snow like the eyes of a demon. Isla could hear the crunch of heavy boots, deliberate, arrogant, rhythmic. Gideon wasn't just tracking her. He was savoring the hunt. "Isla." Gideon's voice drifted into the cave, amplified by the stone walls. "I know you're in there. Little weed. I can smell the rot of your fear. And something else. Something metallic. Did you find a scrap of meat to huddle over?" Inside the cave, the 12 wolves were in a state of agonizing transition. The moonthorn was doing its work, but the process of drawing out fey poison was violent. Keon was slumped against the wall, his eyes glazed. The Alpha King had fallen back into a deep healing trance, his body radiating heat that made the damp cave floor steam. Isla looked at them, 12 lives the world believed were invincible, now as fragile as glass. If Gideon walked in now, he wouldn't see kings or legends. He'd see trophies. He'd slaughter them in their sleep just to claim the glory of killing the royal guard. Asterisk, I have to lead him away. Asterisk, Isla thought, but she was wrong. She believed that because she was nothing in Gideon's eyes, she could be a ghost. She believed she could trick a predator who'd spent years perfecting the art of the kill. She tucked the silver satchel behind a jagged rock and stepped toward the mouth of the cave. She didn't stay in the shadows. She walked right into the flickering light of the torches. "I'm here." "Gideon," she shouted, her voice trembling but loud. The line of hunters stopped. Gideon stood at the front, his silver cloak dusted with white, looking like a god of the tundra. Beside him, Karen held a crossbow, her face twisted in bored malice. "Look at that." Karen laughed. "The rat has a temper. Why are you still breathing?" Isla Gideon's voice was cold. "The storm was supposed to take care of you. I found shelter," Isla said, stepping farther from the cave entrance, trying to draw their eyes to her. It's empty, just rocks and ice. If you want me dead, do it here. Don't stain the mountain with my blood. Gideon narrowed his eyes. He stepped forward, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her neck. Then at the cave entrance behind her, he tilted his head, his nostrils flaring. You were always a terrible liar. Ela, he whispered. An Omega's scent is usually like grass or rain. But you smell of moonthorn and ozone, and the heavy, thick scent of alpha blood. Isla's heart skipped. She'd forgotten that the king's aura was so potent it could cling to her skin like perfume. I found a wounded elk, she stammered, backing away. I was trying to eat. Please, Gideon, just let me go. I'll leave the territory. You'll never see me again. She turned to run, hoping they'd chase her into the tree line, away from the sanctuary. But Gideon was faster, in a blur of silver and fur. He was upon her. He didn't use a weapon. He used the sheer force of his alpha command, Knail. The word hit Ela like a physical weight. Her knees hit the frozen ground with a sickening thud. Her body betrayed her, bowing to the rank she'd been taught to fear since birth. Gideon grabbed her by the hair, forcing her head back. An elk, he looked at his men. Search the cave. Kill anything that moves. Bring me whatever she's protecting. No, Isla screamed, clawing at his hand. There's nothing, it's just me. Kareen stepped forward, aiming her crossbow at the cave's mouth. Maybe it's a rogue, or a cache of silver. Either way, it belongs to Shadowcrest now. Isla realized with crushing horror that by stepping out, she hadn't saved them. She'd confirmed their presence. She'd led the wolf to the fold, her desire to be the hero, to play the martyr, had stripped away the only protection the king had: secrecy. As the hunters moved past her, torches raised, Isla felt a surge of cold, sharp desperation. She wasn't just an Omega anymore. She was the one who'd felt the king's heartbeat against her own. She was the one who'd been trusted with the moonthorn. She reached into her boot and pulled out the small gardening knife she'd hidden there. As Gideon laughed, looking toward the cave, Isla drove the rusted blade into his calf. It wasn't a lethal blow, but it was an insult beyond measure. Gideon roared more in surprise than pain and flung her away. Isla hit a tree, the world spinning into darkness. You little bitch, Gideon growled, limping toward her, his face twisted in pure rage. I was going to let the cold have you. Now I'm going to watch the life leave your eyes personally. He raised his hand, claws extending, shimmering in the torchlight. Ela closed her eyes, waiting for the end, but the blow never came. From the cave, a sound emerged that silenced the wind, the hunters, and the very beating of Ela's heart. It wasn't a howl. It was a low, resonant frequency, a sound that vibrated in the marrow of every living thing present. Gideon froze. The hunters at the cave's mouth stumbled back, their torches falling into the snow and hissing out. Slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness. He wasn't a wolf, and he wasn't quite a man. He was something in between a titan of shadow and gold. His chest bare, the moonthorn paste still staining his ribs. Wrecker stood at the entrance, his eyes no longer sulfur yellow but a piercing glacial blue that held the weight of an entire continent. Behind him, 11 shadows shifted in the dark. The royal guard, standing tall, their fever broken, their loyalty absolute. You, Wrecker said, his voice a quiet thunder that made Gideon's hunters drop their weapons in instinctive terror. "You're the one who threw her into the storm." Isla looked up from the snow, her vision blurred. Seeing the king she'd healed, standing between her and her executioner, the mistake was hers. But the reckoning was about to belong to the world. The silence that followed Wrecker's voice was more deafening than the blizzard had ever been. It was the silence of a world grinding to a halt. The Shadowcrest hunters' men who'd spent their lives bullying those weaker than them were now trembling. Their torches, half buried in snow, cast flickering shadows that made the royal guard appear like giants. Gideon stood frozen, his hand still raised to strike Ela. His breath came in short, jagged plumes. He was an alpha of a mid-sized pack, a man used to being the apex predator in his small woods. But standing before him was something from the old songs, a primal force that made his wolf whimper and tuck its tail. "I asked you a question." "Little Alpha," Wrecker said. He took a single step forward. He didn't growl. He didn't shift. He didn't need to. The sheer atmospheric pressure of his presence forced the two hunters closest to him to drop to their knees. Gideon swallowed hard, his arrogance struggling to maintain its grip. I am Alpha Gideon of Shadowcrest. This is my territory. That girl is a rejected Omega, a criminal under my law. Who are you to interfere with pack justice behind Reka?" Kian stepped into the light. He was still pale, his arm bandaged with a strip of Isla's tunic. But his eyes were sharp. "You speak of justice." Kian's voice was like grinding stone. "You're speaking to Wrecker of the House of Northstar, High King of the 5 territories. And you're standing in the presence of his royal guard." The name hit the clearing like a lightning strike. Karen dropped her crossbow. The weapon clattered uselessly against a frozen root. The hunters scrambled backward, falling over one another to prostrate themselves in the slush. Gideon's face went from rage to ghostly white. His knees buckled not from a command, but from the sudden, crushing weight of his own stupidity. Wrecker ignored him. He walked past the kneeling Alpha as if he were nothing more than a stone in the path. He knelt in the snow beside Isla. Isla looked up at him, her vision swimming. She felt small, broken, filthy. Her threadbare tunic was torn. Her face was bruised where Gideon had thrown her. She still clutched the rusted gardening knife in her trembling hand. She expected him to look at her with pity, or worse, disgust. Instead, Wrecker reached out. His large, warm hand cupped her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a smear of blood. His touch was impossibly soft, a contrast to the lethal power radiating from him. "You fought for us," Wrecker whispered, his voice for her alone, with nothing but a rusted blade and a heart of silver. "You stood against a pack for men who were strangers to you." I made a mistake," Isla choked out, a tear trailing through the dirt on her face. "I led them here. I'm sorry." "Your Majesty." Wrecker's blue eyes darkened with emotion. "You didn't lead them here. Ela, you brought them to their judgment." He stood, but he didn't leave her side. He reached down and took her hand, pulling her up with him. He didn't hold her behind him. He placed her firmly at his right hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "Alpha Gideon." Wrecker's voice rang out cold and absolute. Gideon looked up, his eyes wide with terror. "Your Majesty, I didn't know. The girl, she's just an Omega. A mistake. If I'd known she was under your protection." "She was never under my protection," Wrecker interrupted, his grip on Ela's hand tightening. "I was under hers." He looked at the gathered hunters, then at Karin, who was trying to hide behind a tree. "You looked at this woman and saw a weed. You looked at her and saw something to be discarded in the cold. But I looked at her and saw the only soul in this territory brave enough to face Wraithclaw poison. I saw a healer. I saw a protector. Wrecker turned his gaze back to Gideon. And the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop 20 degrees. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes. Gideon. She hides her greatest treasures in places the proud are too blind to look. You rejected your mate because you wanted a trophy. You wanted power. Wrecker leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. But you're no alpha. An alpha protects the weakest of his flock. You're merely a bully with a title. Please. Gideon stammered, his forehead touching the snow. Take her. If she's your prize, take her. Just spare the pack. She is not a prize. Wrecker snapped. She's the reason my men will see the sun tomorrow. He turned to Ela, and in front of the cowering Shadowcrest pack, in front of his own elite royal guard, the King of the North did something that would be whispered about for generations. He bowed his head to her, a king, acknowledging a higher power, Isla of Shadowcrest. He said, his voice carrying the weight of a decree, "You've been rejected by a coward, but you are claimed by a king, not as a servant, not as an omega." He looked at Gideon. A cruel, triumphant smile touching his lips. By morning, the world will know that Shadowcrest didn't just exile a girl. They exiled their queen. For I, Wrecker Northstar, name you my Luna, my equal, my heart. Ela felt the world tilt. The word times Luna times echoed through her soul like a chime. The rejection mark on her neck, the jagged, ugly scar Gideon had left, suddenly hummed with a different kind of heat. It wasn't the burn of shame anymore. It was the warmth of being truly, finally seen. But as the joy began to bubble up, a sharp, metallic twang shattered the moment. Karin, driven by desperate, suicidal jealousy, had retrieved her crossbow. She didn't aim for the king. She aimed for the rat who'd just been offered the throne she'd spent her life coveting. No, Keon shouted. But he was too far. The bolt hissed through the air. Aimed straight for Ela's heart, the world slipped into slow motion. The thrum of the crossbow string was still echoing when Wrecker moved. He didn't shift. He didn't have to. With a speed that blurred the air, his hand lashed out. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood. Wrecker stood like a statue of ancient wrath. His fingers clamped around the shaft of the bolt, just inches from Isla's throat. The iron tip, coated in a familiar, viscous black sludge, quivered with the force of the impact. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the clearing. Karin stood with the empty crossbow, her chest heaving, the madness of her jealousy finally cooling into the realization of what she'd done. She hadn't just attacked a girl. She'd attempted to assassinate the king's chosen in front of his elite guard. Wrecker looked at the bolt in his hand. His blue eyes tracked the black liquid dripping onto the white snow, hissing as it touched the cold. His expression didn't change, but the air around him began to hum with a lethal charge. Wraithclav Bile, Wrecker said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. He turned his gaze toward Gideon, then to Karin. This poison is rare. It's harvested from fey-touched monsters that haunt the highest peaks, creatures that should have been eradicated from these woods decades ago. He tossed the broken bolt at Gideon's feet. My guard and I were ambushed 6 miles from here. The attackers knew our route. They knew we used the old smuggler's pass to avoid the blizzard. And they were armed with bolts identical to this one. Gideon's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his own execution being prepared. You didn't just exile Ela, Wrecker continued, stepping toward the trembling Alpha. You cleared the path for the ambush. You allowed wraithclaws to hunt in your territory. In exchange for what? A share of the spoils, the promise of a kingdom once the king was dead. No, Your Majesty. I swear, Gideon shrieked, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. It was the girl. She must have brought the poison. She's a witch. Enough. Wrecker commanded. The power in the word forced Gideon's face into the snow. Isla stepped forward, her hand still shaking, but her eyes fixed on the black stain in the snow. She reached into her silver satchel and pulled out a small dried leaf of white sage. She dropped it onto the poison. The leaf turned black and crumbled instantly. It's not just poison, Isla whispered, her voice carrying a weight of realization. It's a beacon. Wraithclaws don't just kill. They track the scent of the bile by firing that bolt. Karen didn't just try to kill me. She signaled them, as if on quay. Allons. Mournful howl rose from the tree line, a sound that was half wolf, half screaming wind. It was followed by another, then a chorus of them. Circling the clearing, the royal guard immediately formed a defensive ring around Wrecker and Ela. Despite their lingering weakness, their blades were out, their eyes glowing with fierce protective gold. They're coming, Keon hissed, his obsidian blade catching the moonlight. They're coming to finish what they started. Gideon's hunters panicked. They broke rank, some running toward the forest, others trying to force their way into the cave. But the shadows of the Blackwood were no longer empty. Massive, mangy shapes burst from the underbrush. They were twice the size of a standard wolf, their fur matted with filth, their eyes glowing with a sickly pale green light. These were Wraithclaws, fey-blooded exiles of the wolf world, driven mad by their own tainted magic. One of the creatures lunged at Corinne. She screamed, throwing her arms up, but the beast was intercepted midair by Maddox, the largest of Wrecker's guard. With a roar, Maddox tore the creature down, but two more took its place. The clearing turned into a chaotic battlefield of silver, blood, and shadow. Isla felt a cold hand of terror grip her heart. Then she felt Wrecker's arms slide around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Stay close to me," he growled, his eyes never leaving the tree line. The satchel Isla shouted over the din of battle. "Leka, the silver thread. My mother told me, silver is poison to us. But to the fey-blooded, it's a cage. If I can get to the center of the clearing, I can use the resonance. It's too dangerous." Wrecker snapped, pivoting to kick a lunging Wraithclaw back into the darkness. "You called me a queen," Ela countered, her amber eyes burning with fierce defiance. "A queen doesn't hide behind her king while her people bleed. Trust me." Wrecker looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the girl who'd braved a blizzard to save him. The girl who'd been rejected by the world and yet chose to heal it. He saw the silver threads of the satchel glowing brighter, reacting to the malevolent magic of the Wraithclaws. Keon Maddox Wrecker roared, "Clear a path for the Luna." The royal guard moved as one. They didn't question. They obeyed. They carved a bloody corridor through the snarling monsters, their movements synchronized and lethal. Ela ran. She reached the center of the clearing, right where the black poison had stained the snow. She knelt, dumping the contents of her satchel onto the ground, the herbs, the flint, the moonthorn, and the satchel itself. She grabbed the loose silver threads at the seams, her fingers stinging as the metal reacted to her own wolf blood. She began to chant a low, melodic rhythm her mother had whispered to her in the herb gardens. A song of binding, a song of the earth. The silver threads began to unravel, stretching out like glowing spiderwebs across the snow. They didn't just lie there. They sought out the black bile. Neutralizing it with a hiss of white steam, the wraith claws recoiled. The silver light was anathema to them, a searing barrier that burned their tainted skin. They began to circle Isla, snarling in agony. Unable to cross the glowing perimeter, she was weaving, but the effort was draining her. Isla's face went pallid, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the silver drew on her life force to maintain the ward. Gideon, seeing his chance in the chaos, ignored the monsters. He saw Isla vulnerable, glowing. The source of his undoing, he shifted. His silver-gray wolf form exploded from his skin, and he lunged not at the wraith claws, but at the girl who'd once been his worthless Omega. Isla Wrecker's roar was a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Gideon's wolf was a blur of malice, his jaws wide and aimed for Isla's throat. He was a creature of pure vengeance, willing to die just to ensure she didn't live to wear the crown he'd denied her. Isla didn't flinch. She couldn't. Her hands were anchored to the silver threads, her spirit woven into the light. She looked up at the oncoming beast, her amber eyes reflecting not fear, but cold, ancient clarity. But Wrecker was faster than hate. He didn't just shift. He erupted. The human skin of the king tore away to reveal a wolf of impossible proportions, a creature of midnight fur and starlight eyes. The first wolf of the legends. He intercepted Gideon midair. There was no struggle, only a brutal, decisive end. Wrecker's massive jaws clamped onto Gideon's neck. The sound of snapping bone echoed through the clearing like a dry branch in winter. Wrecker tossed the limp, silver-gray form into the snow. Gideon the Alpha, who'd built a kingdom on the backs of the weak, was reduced to a heap of matted fur and broken pride. But the battle wasn't over. The wraith claws, sensing the ward flickering as Isla's strength waned, surged forward. The silver light was dimming, the threads turning gray as they drained the life from her veins. Isla. Stop, Keon shouted, hacking through a snarling monster. The silver is eating you. Let it go. I can't, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The silver threads had wrapped around her wrists like burning manacles. If I stop, they'll kill everyone. She felt her heart slowing, the cold of the blizzard finally finding a way into her core through the magic. Her vision began to narrow, the world turning into a tunnel of white. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. Not a human hand, a massive Varmpav, Wrecker, in his wolf form, stood over her. He didn't pull her away. Instead, he leaned his massive head down and pressed his forehead against hers. Through the touch, the Luna bond snapped into place. It wasn't just a title anymore. It was a conduit. Wrecker didn't just give her his strength. He gave her his sovereignty. The celestial power of the Alpha King flowed into Isla, turning the silver threads from flickering white to blinding solar gold. The ward exploded outward, a wave of pure lunar energy sweeping through the clearing. The wraith claws didn't just recoil. They disintegrated, their tainted bodies turning to ash before they could even howl in pain. The black bile in the snow evaporated, leaving the ground pristine and white once more. The silence that followed was absolute. Isla collapsed, her hands finally free from the silver. The threads of the satchel had returned to their seams, though they now shimmered with a permanent, quiet pulse. She felt herself being lifted not by a wolf, but by the man Wrecker had become again. He held her against his bare chest, his heart thundering against her ear. He was shaking. The king who feared nothing was trembling as he checked her pulse. Isla, he whispered, his voice cracked with emotion. Ila, look at me. She opened her eyes slowly. The clearing was empty of monsters. The Shadow Crest hunters were huddled in the distance, guarded by the silent, grim members of the Royal Guard. Corinne was on her knees, staring at the body of Gideon with hollow, unseeing eyes. Is it done? Isla asked. It's done, Wrecker said. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. The poison is gone. The traitor is fallen. And you've saved a kingdom twice in one night. He looked up at his men. The 12 wolves of the Royal Guard stood in a semicircle. Onebe won. They knelt. They didn't kneel for the king this time. They knelt for the woman in his arms. The sun is rising, Maddox said, his voice a low rumble of respect. Isla looked toward the horizon. The first light of dawn was bleeding over the peaks, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. The blood winter was over. The hunter's moon had set, leaving behind a world that felt new, scrubbed clean by the very storm that was meant to destroy her. Wrecker stood, carrying her with a grace that made her feel weightless. He walked toward the Shadow Crest packhouse, the fortress that had been her prison. The heavy oak doors were still barred from the inside. Wrecker didn't knock. He looked at the wood, and his voice carried the weight of a god's decree. Open the doors. Your queen has returned. And she's bringing the light with her. There was a frantic scraping of iron, a fumbling of locks. Then the door swung wide. The elders, the servants, the wolves who'd watched her be exiled just hours ago, they stood in the hall, their faces a tapestry of shock and dawning realization. Wrecker walked into the center of the hall. He didn't look at the throne. He looked at the kitchen entryway where Isla used to hide. Then at the tapestry that had been her only shield. He set Ila down on her feet, but didn't let go of her hand. Today, Wrecker announced to the silent room, Shadow Crest pack ends, and the Royal Pack begins. This hall will no longer be built on the silence of Omegas. It will be built on the wisdom of healers. He turned to Isla, his blue eyes soft with promise, but before he could speak, a small elderly woman pushed through the crowd. It was Brena, the cook who tried to speak for her. She held a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. She didn't look at the king. She looked at Isla. Welcome home, child, Brena whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. We've been waiting a long time for someone to bring the warmth back. Isla took the cloth, her fingers brushing the old woman's hand. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an apology. She felt like a bridge, but as the pack began to murmur in hope, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Corinne, who'd been brought in by the guard, wasn't looking for mercy. She was looking at the silver satchel Ila had left on the table. Corinne's hand crept toward a hidden dagger in her belt, her eyes fixed on Ila's back. The flash of steel was a silver whisper in Ila's peripheral vision. Corinne, stripped of her beauty by madness and grief, lunged. It wasn't a warrior's strike. It was the frantic, jagged motion of a cornered animal. She didn't reach Isla. Wrecker didn't even have to move. Keon, who'd been standing like a shadow behind the king, intercepted Karin's wrist with a grip that made the dagger clatter to the stone floor. He didn't strike her. He simply held her immobile, his face a mask of cold disappointment. The great hall, once a place of raucous celebration, fell into a silence so profound you could hear the soft hiss of the dying fire in the hearth. Karen collapsed to her knees, sobbing, not out of repentance, but out of the sheer crushing weight of her failure. She's nothing. Karin shrieked, her voice echoing off the rafters where Isla used to clean cobwebs. She's an Omega. You're throwing away a bloodline for a girl who smells of bleach and dirt. Wrecker stepped forward, He didn't look at Karen with anger. He looked at her with profound, quiet pity, far more cutting. "You speak of bloodlines," Wrecker said, his voice low and steady. "But a crown is not a piece of jewelry. And a Luna is not a title of birth. It's a title of service." He looked around the hall, his gaze resting on the weary faces of servants, Omegas, and warriors who'd been led by a tyrant. Ela didn't ask for a throne. She asked for Moonthorn. She didn't seek power. She sought to keep 12 strangers warm in a cave when the world had turned its back on her. Wrecker turned to Isla, a silent question in his eyes. He was the king of the north. He could have ended Karen with a word, but he stepped back, yielding the floor to the woman he'd just named, his equal. Isla walked toward Karen. Every eye in the hall followed her. She reached down, but she didn't pick up the dagger. She picked up the silver satchel. The threads were singed, blackened by the intensity of the ward she'd cast, but they still hummed with a faint, resilient silver light. "You spent your life looking down, Karin," Isla said softly. "You looked down at the floors I scrubbed, at the clothes I mended, and you thought that made me small. But because I was down there, I saw the roots. I saw how this pack was rotting from the inside." Isla looked at the elders who'd remained silent while she was exiled. "Gideon is gone. The Wraithclaws are gone, but the cold remains." She reached into her satchel and pulled out the last of the Moonthorn, paced the violet medicine that had saved the king. She didn't use it on herself. She walked to an old Omega man near the front of the crowd, whose hands were gnarled and blue from frostbite. She gently began to rub the paste into his skin. "The royal pack does not exile its own," Ela announced, her voice gaining strength that made the stone walls seem to lean in. "Karen will not be executed. She will not be exiled. She will stay." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Karen looked up, her face a mask of confusion. "But she will not be a Luna," Isla continued. "She will serve in the kitchens. She will scrub the floors of the infirmary. She will learn the names of every Omega she once walked past. She will learn that the strength of a wolf isn't in how high they hold their head, but in how deep they reach to help those below them. When she understands that the dirt on her hands is more honorable than the silk on her back, then, and only then, will she be free." It was a judgment of profound humanity, the underdog's justice, not a reversal of bullying, but a redirection toward empathy. Wrecker watched her, a look of such raw, unadulterated pride on his face. It brought a flush to Ela's cheeks. He walked to the center of the hall and struck his heel against the stone. "Shadowcrest is no more." Wrecker's voice boomed. "This territory is now under the direct protection of the royal throne. We leave at mid-morning for the capital. Ela, my Luna, will lead the procession." The morning was spent in a whirlwind of activity. The royal guard, though still mending, moved with newfound energy, helping the pack organize supplies. The air in the hall had changed. The scent of bleach and fear was being replaced by cedarwood fires and aromatic herbs Ela had distributed to the healers. As the sun climbed higher, the royal airship, a massive enchanted vessel of wood and silver, descended through the clouds, its shadow crossing the blackwood forest like the wing of a great bird. Isla stood on the steps of the pack house, watching as the people she'd grown up with prepared for a future they hadn't thought possible. She felt a hand on the small of her back. "Are you ready?" Wrecker asked. He'd changed into a formal tunic of deep navy, the insignia of the North Star glowing on his collar. He looked every bit the king, but his eyes were only for the girl in the threadbare tunic. "I don't have a dress," Isla whispered. suddenly hit by a wave of old insecurity. I'm going to the capital looking like an exile. Wrecker smiled a brilliant, warm smile that reached his eyes. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a heavy, shimmering fabric. It wasn't navy or black. It was a cloak of silver fox, fur lined with silk, that felt like water. You're not going as an exile, Wrecker said, draping the cloak over her shoulders. And you're not going as a trophy. He reached out and touched the silver satchel still slung over her shoulder. You're going as the woman who held the line. Let them see the threads you wove. Let them see the girl who knew the cure when kings were dying. As they walked toward the airship, the pack lined the path. They didn't cheer with the hollow, practice noise they'd given Gideon. They stood in profound, respectful silence, bowing their heads as she passed. Ela paused at the boarding ramp. She looked back at the blackwood forest, at the jagged cliff where the hidden cave sat. She could still see the faint wisp of smoke from the fire she'd built there. She realized then that her life hadn't started when Wrecker named her Luna. It had started the moment she chose to strike the flint in the dark. The capital of the North was not a place of stone and iron like Shadowcrest. It was a city woven into the white cliffs of the Great Peak, a sprawling masterpiece of silver spires and hanging gardens where waterfalls cascaded from the heights, turning into mist before they hit the ground. For Ela, arriving at the royal palace felt like stepping into a storybook she'd been forbidden to read. But the most remarkable change wasn't the scenery. It was the atmosphere. In the month that followed their return, the rejected Omega became a figure of quiet revolution. Ela didn't spend her days sitting on a velvet throne in the Great Hall. Instead, she could be found in the Royal Conservatory, a massive glass dome where plants from every corner of the continent were nurtured. She'd replaced her threadbare tunic with gowns of soft wool and silk. But she refused to stop wearing her silver satchel. It was no longer frayed. The royal weavers had carefully restored the threads, adding new filaments of pure lunar silver that hummed with the steady, calm heartbeat of the land. It had become a symbol across the city. Omegas who'd spent their lives in the shadows began to carry their own pouches of herbs, their heads held a little higher, realizing that what the world called weakness was actually the world's greatest medicine. One afternoon, as the first thaw of spring began to turn the mountain slopes green, Ela stood in the center of the conservatory. She was surrounded by a group of young pups, many of them Omegas from packs as far away as the Southern Isles. She was showing them how to identify the difference between common ivy and the life-saving moonthorn. True power, Ela told them, her voice gentle yet resonant, isn't in the claws you use to tear things down. It's in the hands you use to put them back together. Every weed you walk past has a secret. Your job is to listen. From the arched doorway, Wrecker watched her. He was no longer the blood-stained wolf from the cave or the cold king of the trial. He wore the relaxed clothes of a man at peace. His blue eyes soft as they tracked Ila's movements. He didn't interrupt. He simply leaned against the stone, content to be the moon to her sun. When the lesson ended and the pups scrambled away, their laughter echoing against the glass, Wrecker walked to her side. He didn't pull her into a royal embrace. He simply took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint silvery scars on her wrists where the ward had once burned her. The healers in the city are calling it the Ela effect, Wrecker said, a touch of wit in his voice. They say the hospitals are emptier because people are learning to take care of one another before the poison takes root. Ela smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. They're just learning what we've always known. Leka, that nobody is worthless, not even a Wade. They walked out onto the balcony overlooking the vast kingdom. In the distance, The blackwood forest was a smudge of deep green against the horizon, somewhere down there. Karen was scrubbing the floors of an infirmary, learning the names of the people she'd once ignored. Somewhere else, the survivors of Shadow Crest were building a new life, guided by alphas who chose to lead with their hearts instead of their teeth. The rejection that had once been Ela's greatest shame was now the foundation of her strength. She realized that the moon goddess hadn't sent her into the storm to die. She'd sent her to find the only man strong enough to stand beside a woman who didn't need a crown to be a queen. The sun began to set, casting long, golden light over the palace. It was a quiet, hopeful image, a king and a Luna, standing not above their people, but with them. As the first flowers of spring pushed through the retreating snow, they proved something Isla had always believed. Healing always begins in the dark, but it always ends in the light. I've spent years studying stories of resilience and transformation, the ones that show us what real strength looks like when the world tries to break us. This is one of those stories. 5. Takeaway points. Point 1. True power isn't in how loud you roar. It's in what you do when no one's watching. Isla could have let the 12 dying wolves freeze in that cave. She owed them nothing, but she knelt in the cold, ground the moonthorn with her own tears, and fought the poison that was killing a king. That choice, made in the dark, with no reward in sight, is what separated her from everyone who ever underestimated her. Point 2. The world will call you weak for the very thing that makes you strong. They looked at Isla and saw a servant who smelled of kitchen lye and dirt. But because she spent her life on her knees in the herb gardens, she was the only one who knew how to save them. The same hands they mocked for scrubbing floors were the hands that held the cure when the king's life was slipping away. Point 3. Rejection doesn't define you. How you rise after it does. Gideon threw her into a blizzard and called her a weed. Hours later, she stood in front of his hunters with nothing but a rusted blade, protecting the king he tried to kill. She didn't become a queen because someone gave her a crown. She became one the moment she chose to fight for strangers when her own pack wanted her dead. Point 4. Real leadership isn't about standing above people. It's about reaching down. When Isla had the power to destroy Corinne, the woman who tried to kill her twice, she didn't. She gave her a chance to learn what it means to serve. Not as punishment, but as a path back to humanity. That's the kind of strength that doesn't just win battles. It transforms kingdoms. Point 5. Healing always starts in the darkest places. Isla didn't find her purpose in the Great Hall under torchlight and applause. She found it in a frozen cave, with 12 dying wolves and a choice to make. The storm that was meant to kill her became the doorway to everything she was meant to be. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the beginning of the story you were always supposed to live.